Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today I am back with a sketchbook painting, and I thought of doing like a nature scene with rocks, pebbles, wild grass, wildflowers, and like maybe a pond or a stream or a running river. So for the first step, I'm sketching out the rocks and how I want the placement to be, and then I'm going to outline each rock in gray. So I drew them in similar sizes but different shapes, and then I leave like a little space in between each of them, and that's where I'm going to paint the wild flowers, wild grass later. So for the parts of the rocks which I'm outlining in brown, that's going to be part of the rocks that are submerged underwater. Once I'm done outlining all the rocks, I paint the insides of the rocks, followed by colors. So this one's right now I'm painting them in gray, and then for these ones I'm painting them in dark brown. So right now there's not much details done yet, but I just want to slowly fill up the space, and then I'll gradually build the landscape. Next, I'm going to paint in between the gray rocks. Over here I'm using a dark, very dark shade of green mixed with brown and just a bit of black. And on the top right of the canvas is where the light hits the water, so it's going to be in a lighter shade of, I mix blue with brown and also titanium white. So I know blue is often used as a representation of water, but realistically water's transparent, so it's actually the color that of the surface below the water, which is usually like greenish and brown. So I was trying to mimic that color, so I use a bit of olive green and brown to paint that part of the water close to the rocks. Once that is done, it's time to give the rocks a little bit of shape. So this can be done by adding shading around the sides. So around the edges I paint it in a darker color, and then on the top I mix a little bit of light brown with light gray, and by applying from light to dark, this will help me to contour the shape of the rocks. So if I want to make the surface smaller, then I add darker gray around the sides, and if I want the surface of the rock to be wider, then I add more light gray. I wanted to keep this natural, so I'm kind of making them like in different shapes and different sizes. And once the gray rocks are done, I take a fine tip brush and I paint that dark part in between the rocks properly, and make sure to cover all these white lines or white edges around the rock. Once I've made sure to cover all the nook and crannies between the rocks, then I'm going to work on the submerged rocks and also the shallow water next to the shore. So for the water, I'm painting it in this kind of like greenish muddy color, but I want to paint it slightly darker than the rocks. They're about the same shade, but just slightly darker. Again, I take a fine tip brush and make sure to cover all these white lines or white edges around the rocks, and really get in like in between all this to make sure it's covered. I think the trickiest part for this was trying to paint the water, like trying to find the right shade. And also right now I'm painting the part where the reflection of the water is, so it's supposed to be a bit bluish because it's going to reflect the color of the sky. To soften the transition from that muddy color to the blue, I add a little bit of both the colors in the middle, just to kind of like soften it a little bit so it's not so blue in your face immediately. So right now I'm just using a wet brush. I'm just trying to blend both these colors in so it looks a little bit more natural. So for the next step, I want to add a little bit of texture on the rocks so that it looks a bit worn out, not like smooth pebbles. So I'm taking like a very worn out brush, so it's a bit rough around the edges. And I'm going to make this short little strokes around the rocks, following the contour that I've done earlier. And I also want to add just a little bit of brown in it, just to kind of give it a more natural sort of look. Once the first rock is done, I'm going to move on to the next, and I like how it looks so far. It looks a little bit more worn out with time and nature, and also like a little bit more realistic, I would say. So I'm going to continue this process for all the rocks. It's up to you how much brown you want to put, how much texture you want to give it. And then once that is done, we're going to work on my favorite part. Okay, so I'm going to take a size 000 brush and I'm going to paint these very tiny little delicate leaves between the rocks. I'm going to start with dark green first, and then I'm going to add highlights on it by adding tiny lighter green leaves on top. So I wanted to add a bit of variety here in terms of the plants so it doesn't look too boring. So I'm going to draw a couple of larger size leaves here. I think this is maybe like a subfamily of the Monstera plant. And then I want to add a little bit of fern sticking out from between the rocks. Actually, I really enjoyed painting the fern. I'm trying to keep it as delicate as possible, so I'm using the size 000 brush to make sure I get those very thin lines on the fern leaves. So as you can see, for the larger space in between the rocks, I try to fill it up more by adding kind of like bigger leaves and more plants. And then once the paint is dry, we're going to go back to this Monstera leaf and add the lining in between. So continue to fill up the space in between the rocks with all these green plants. You can be creative with it and add whatever plants you want to add. And I'm also adding a little bit of grass, blades of grass popping up from between. And as usual, just to give it the variety, I add different shades of leaves sprouting out. Throughout this whole painting, this was the part which I actually enjoyed painting the most. And then now I'm just adding the final touches of this another wild plant here. And once it is done, I've decided to add just a little bit of flowers in white. So I just take the tip of the paintbrush and I add a few tiny dots of white around this whole green patch here, just a little bit. Once that is done, I continue to work on the rocks that are submerged underwater. I found that it was a little bit too bright, so I darken it a little bit so it kind of matches the shape of the shallow water. And then I add a bit of ripples using dark brown and white near the light part of the water where the reflection is supposed to be. And because this whole thing looks a little bit dull, I would say, in all these earthy colors, I've decided to paint orange butterfly on the center rock, so it's like the focus of the focus point of this painting. Because it's a bit tiny, I couldn't really draw the whole details of a monarch butterfly, so this will have to do. Anyway, I hope you like this nature piece, and thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Goodbye.